Thank you. So it does say I'm from ISU, but I've just accepted a job at the INL, and so on Monday I'm starting at the INL full-time. And I'll be adjuncting with ISU, but when I made this presentation, I was fully on ISU. Anyways, and then like I said, I'm just started a PhD program at U of I, and so this is my first foray into establishing what I'll ultimately do for my dissertation. So slightly crowdsourcing, so I'm open to hear all the great ideas, so then I can take them and use them and do a PhD on them. Just kidding. So I'm going to be working with Ralph Lay on cyber education. So there's going to be some awesome things coming. So, all right. So title for today is talking about measuring cyber influence in systems. Very high level, very abstract at the moment, but really getting at the idea of, is this even measurable, and what's the trade-offs, those type of things. So a couple assumptions up front. The lack of signal purpose. So right, one of your features in industrial operations, if it's not participating in the goal, don't have it on your infrastructure, period. We're not an IT shop where you can have general machines that don't participate with the larger goals. But in industrial systems, if there is no signal that's ultimately being produced or consumed by that device, it should not exist on your infrastructure. So my analysis assumes anything on the infrastructure is participating in the overall goal of that system. And if it's not, it should not exist, so it will not exist in this model. I know in reality, that's a mixed bag due to maybe laziness on the employees, that they leave equipment on their infrastructure that doesn't no longer have any value, but I'm assuming the ideal case in this analysis. And then I'm also assuming that if there is a vulnerability, it's assumed to be compromised in the analysis. It's being used to create the issue as intended. But I do realize in reality, just because there's a vulnerability doesn't actually mean it's been found or being used in that given moment. But I'm making that assumption here. So I want to start by breaking down this model that I've started to shape up to get at this idea of, can you measure cyber influence in systems? And as we've heard in other talks this morning, graph technology has been, you could say, the leading vehicle to organize our information because it's very relational in its value, as opposed to traditional data mechanisms where relationships are joined at the execution of the query. In graph databases, you're able to store relationships as a chief component, which you could say gives way to thinking about this type of a problem. So I've organized my current model in 4 different layers. The bottom layer, and we'll go through each layer, but the bottom layer is infrastructure, so that's how the system is realistically put together. What defines a relationship is an actual communication path between equipment nodes. Without it, a communication pathway, there is no link between those nodes. It's as simple as that. And then the layers up above are the capability, or say the feature layer, or capability, vulnerability, or the cybersecurity layer, and then the process layer, which helps inform where the signals are sourced from and where they're destined to. So I've termed this one the party model because they're like balloons hanging off an equipment node. And so the more balloons you have, the bigger the party is at that node. So if you're into partying, you just go to where all the balloons are at, and that's kind of where you can start from or think about the problem. So that kind of gives you an overview of how I'm thinking about this model from the onset. So if I start at the bottom layer, right, the infrastructure layer, like I said, each node is the actual equipment, and the communication pathways is what defines that link between them. Without any kind of communication, there is no relationship in this context. So there's no way to essentially influence in this type of model. Granted, in reality, right, there is mechanisms to traverse a non-connected network, but at this current state, I'm not analyzing for them. it's probably some future work, as I'll identify at the end. So you could say this represents, you could say that traditional IT approach where you have your network topology diagrams, those type of artifacts that administrators, technicians, analysts are using to find insight on how their infrastructure is pieced together. And so that really sets the foundation for what this model is built around. And really sets the overall, you could say, sets the overall vehicle where influence can actually be promulgated. So moving up a layer is the feature layer. And when I say feature, I'm talking about a security setting. And I've been really impressed by some of the presentations this morning, the STIX tool and those type of things, as you could say deep research. I'm trying to go up to the higher level of, like, if you're a technician or an analyst, kind of speaking at known controls, like do you have a password policy? Do you do network segmentation? And really trying to find that level of information. So this could turn into some type of planning type tool for business decision makers, those type of things that if you present them with all the deep research, they'll get overwhelmed. So these features I rely on, like STIGs. STIGs are a very powerful body of knowledge that relay common security configurations that you can implement into various technologies. And this comes from my naval nuclear days with the naval nuclear program, because as the federal government, you're required by law to implement STIGs on your infrastructure. And so taking advantage of that background is kind of providing the information for this feature layer. So if you could say your underlying equipment node is like a Windows 10 box, you can rely on the Windows 10 STIG as a body of knowledge to identify what controls you've applied to there. And that would then identify those feature balloons that hang off that equipment node that kind of help to inform how much security have you applied to this node. So one caveat there, that middle section, the thing that I'm really after is what's that area of effect, that distance that control affects that infrastructure. Is it just at that single node, or is there arguments to be made that that control also speaks to or has an effect to adjacent nodes or nodes that are multiple hops away? So stay tuned. That's one of the chief areas that I've started to find my way into, and it's one of the things I'm wondering at this current state: is this useful? Is it too simple? Is it too complex? And so that as we play through an example, I'll start to answer that and see how that ties into some future work as I'm moving down this direction. So moving up a layer is the next one, is the vulnerability layer. So just like with STIGs, just like with those implementation guides, we have a CVSS system that in the National Vulnerability Database that's collecting known vulnerabilities that have been proved, you could say, to have an effect against certain equipment. And so I rely on the scoring system, and a lot of the academic research I read through also uses the CVSS as a key metric to test for you could say, the intensity of that vulnerability. And most of us are familiar with the CVSS system, so I won't dig into that in this lecture. But I'm speaking to the fact that that's one of the chief vehicles I'm using to provide weight to a given vulnerability. So you could quickly see that equipment potentially has known vulnerabilities, and as I say, those are the pea shooters, the party that are popping out the balloons. So you can think about it like as you get more security controls, the idea is it lifts your equipment node up, but as you get more vulnerabilities, it's starting to drag it down. And can that coupling start to inform a level of influence that the cybersecurity is having in the system, is the overall idea that I'm trying to get at here. So I see that it helps deflate the level of cybersecurity protection for a specific node, or potentially an area of effect. Because just like with the feature layer, there's this idea of can you measure the area of effect of that vulnerability? And just even this morning, said in some of the lectures, there might be something in helping the sticks and those type of tools help provide an automated weighting system into this idea, where at the moment it's very conceptual and academic. And then finally, the signal layer. So this layer is ultimately what decides the important pathway by which to take. Because you can imagine a signal is when you have an engineer that needs to deploy a PLC program to their PLC, the pathway is from their workstation through the infrastructure to that PLC. That's the overall signal. And as that signal provides the ultimate path for analysis. Because this all comes back to is how is that signal being affected as it's passing through equipment that's both secured as well as it has known vulnerabilities, and how does that signal then get impacted by that relationship. And so not all signals are created the same, so there's an idea of what's the signal criticality that's being maintained at this level. How important is this signal? Right? Being able to configure a device is a very important signal. Being able to read a value may be important. It all depends on what that value is actually doing within the larger process. Right? There are certain signal types that have some level of importance, but they're not as important as other signals. And so that's what we're trying to make a judgment against in this layer, is ultimately where's that relationship between the source and consumer of that signal, and then making a judgment about how important is that signal, and to let that play into this overall scheme of deciding the cyber influence, because obviously you want stronger influence for your more critical signals in your system. And you can assume a level of risk when you have certain signals that just don't fit within your threshold. They're there, but they don't have a value for you that others do. So yeah. So like I said, this is the reason for celebration in this model, is where does the importance lie? And that's what this one's getting at. So I did have an animation, but then I realized I'm not actually presenting. So the graphic here, anybody ever watch National Treasure by Nicolas Cage? Those ones? They have the glasses that put the color coding down and it makes things appear and disappear. This is the mental model that I was having as controls, as features are being layered on the system. It's giving you a level of view. And then as vulnerabilities are coming on the system, it's altering that view. And so I thought that was a neat graphic to kind of get at what's in my mind. But like I mentioned, one of the chief things that I'm trying to do is what's the area of effect, or that distance by which a control or a vulnerability affects in a system. And so I'm come up with this thing called the adjacency matrix that lines up ultimately, at the moment, a systematic judgment, but I could see how other tools might be able to automatically inform this idea of the adjacency matrix, because it's this matrix that allows you to transfer the overall scoring of your vulnerabilities and your controls into the other nodes appropriately. So the way this is broken down is the number of rows are dependent on the number of equipment that you have in your infrastructure layer. And then the number of columns is determined by the features or vulnerabilities, because there's a feature adjacency matrix and a vulnerability adjacency matrix stored at each node. So each node has an awareness or a determination via this matrix, that level of effect. And at the current state, it's very binary. But as we'll see in the future research discussion, some avenues to help grow this and make it more fine-tuned. But this is really at the heart of this mindset, is using this concept of an adjacency matrix to propagate those scores around appropriately based on your ultimate signal path. So I'm a teacher, so in my mind I'm like, should I stop and ask for questions? Anyways, I just thought it was funny. So the other thing is, there's an automation here. So that idea of the multicolored glasses, this is how I'm thinking about it. As you're layering a certain control, deciding the overall size of that circle is really what's at the heart of that adjacency matrix. And so as you're overlaying, it's really getting at the intensity of the color. And as you layer more colors, you're obviously getting closer to black, as you, and those type of things. But when I think about the actual mathematics of making that transition, it's getting this idea of a transfer function. And what I was seeking was normalize it, because normalize it keeps it consistent so I don't have runaway numbers, numbers that start to get out of control and lead to a ultimate corruption of the result of this model. And so how I'm doing that is at each of the nodes, I'm summing up my feature scores, normalizing them, and then using that to subtract away the vulnerability scoring system that's ultimately arrives there. And then that's being normalized so that it keeps it consistent from a 0 to 1 type mentality. And then I keeps it appropriately connected, and then by dividing by the overall features, keeps it in a percentage from 0 to 100%. So the idea is you strengthen your features, and then as you subtract away the vulnerabilities, you're left with some percentage of the overall cybersecurity protection. So, and then you could, as you play this out in your head, right, as your number of vulnerabilities increase, it starts to detract away from the overall feature scoring. So you're wanting to improve your feature scoring and reduce the amount of detraction that's being provided by the vulnerability scoring is the overall goal in this model. And like I said, when it comes to the vulnerability scoring, I'm relying on CVSS at the moment to provide that scoring system. But from a feature scoring, I've started to play around with some scoring system, but in my mind, it really presents an opportunity, and I'm open to hear, are you guys aware of any kind of ideas out there to help provide almost like a security control scoring system? Yeah. Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yep. No, and I can respect that. And that's, I'm hoping as I continue to develop this idea of the adjacency matrix, that might help provide that shortcomings of the lack of context, because as we see, like in the security researcher layer, the level of depth you can get to gets unwieldy, and at some point you just have to say what is sufficient. And so I'm trying to strike that balance, but there's always more, which keeps us all employed, technically. Yeah. Yeah, like, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just even from the discussions I sat in this morning, is my first exposure to sticks. Um, and so I'm looking at possibly in like S-bombs, obviously, as a vehicle to, because those have been demonstrated like very complex structures down there. Can those signatures be used to inform the adjacency? Like the pattern we find in sticks, can that promulgate its way up into informing the adjacency matrix that then shows you if I apply this, or this vulnerability has this effect in the infrastructure, and then boil it up to that level. So that's where I'm thinking is a new thought just even this morning. And then one of the thoughts when you're talking about ignorance is the personnel problem. Just this, there's a joke at the Naval Nuclear Facility is we are secure on paperwork, but you actually look at the system. It's debatable how much you actually implemented based on what you wrote down. And so, like, can you trust the paper versus actually providing the assessment against the realistic system? And so that naturally lends itself to relying on tools, agents, those type of things to help inform the model. So as I'm building this out and taking it from this theoretical into an actual real-life tool, looking at developing those automation schemes into here. So like STIG, if I'm relying on STIG as my, you could say, vehicle to decide what type of controls in there, well, they have SCAP. So I can use SCAP scans to help ingest that information to immediately start informing that feature score. So those are the type of vehicles I'm using to try to break through to that idea that you brought up. Okay. So finally, because all cybersecurity is around impact, that is what we're most concerned about, because cybersecurity at the end of the day is risk management. And so risk management is based on the idea of consequence, and consequence is synonymous, you could say, with impact. So what I've started to put here is working with some others in the power space. The power grid is my example. Working with like Dakota Robertson. He helped line out some of these ideas of impact, especially in the power grid. So I've circled those around as the various vectors of impact. And you can see that as you go out, the consequence of impact, whether low, moderate, or high, to keep it simple, because I see this becoming more of like a planning type tool for those decision makers, not necessarily for the researcher under the hood. But as your signal criticality, that helps inform the size of the categorization. So as you can see very clearly, when you have a high, there's more potential to be in the red area, and the red area is the bad area. Whereas the yellow area it's bad, but it's still acceptable. The green is it's well within your acceptance criteria. But then your criticality level for your signal helps give you breathing room, whereas your high criticality signals reduces that breathing room because your heart is to try to mitigate as much as possible, because those are your high impact areas in your system, is for those critical signals. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a simple example, because as your system scope, your system infrastructure grows, the complexity grows, the size of your matrix can get very big very quickly. So I want to keep it simple for this talk. And so I prototyped this example off the substation that's over in room 203. It's a new one that we did to do research. It's an actual substation that has all the same equipment you'd find in a substation, all the protection equipment, all the that type of stuff. So you guys ever want to see it, let me know, and we can get you in there and you can take a look at it even this afternoon if you'd like. So this architecture is it has 8 feeders, 4 on each side with a tiebreaker between the two to bring in 2 generation signals down each of those tie lines. On that is managed a local area network with a SCL managed switch that then connects to all the various protection equipment, as you see here by the bolded lines here. And then you can see that the engineering workstation, and then there's an RTEC. So fairly simple system, but it is an example nonetheless. So the first step is to take that infrastructure view from the communication perspective and represent it as that infrastructure layer. And so you see the various nodes and how they're connected. So that's defining the ultimate pathways by which cyber influence may take. So the reason I felt this example is important is, I don't know if you guys saw, I imagine all of you did, that the National Vulnerability Database released probably 12.5 SEO vulnerabilities on August 31st. They got hit pretty hard. It's really around 2 products. Their Accelerator Quickset Configurator and the Grid Configurator tools got hit pretty hard. Well, it was useful because we're using those tools on that substation. So I was able to build the example around that. So as you see, there was 11 vulnerabilities released, and so the one tool is this Accelerator Quickset software, and you can see it's used by engineering tech to quickly and easily configure the devices for power system protection. The other colleagues I've had, they're using this tool now. The question is, did they update? I'm assuming they did not update, so I'm assuming the vulnerabilities exist and they're in effect in this analysis. And if you guys want, you can, there's the view of those. So, okay. So, as I start to populate the model, right? So this exists on the engineering workstation is where that software is deployed, where that quickset software exists that they're using to configure the relay protection equipment. So from a signal point of view, right, the source is, this is their configuration tool that's sending the configuration from this workstation to the relay protection devices that are the breaker controls, the tie breaker, the reclosers, those type of things. Hanging off that is the 11 or so vulnerabilities that existed currently for that software. And then hanging off on the feature side is the security controls that have been implemented on that workstation according to the STIG that we find, especially if you've operated in the government and are required by law to implement STIG type settings. So that really defines the party that's happening here at the equipment node. So as we start to play through the model, this helps form up those adjacency matrix based on the controls, based on the vulnerabilities. So as you can see in this example, right, the vulnerability side, since that it's about the quickset product, well, that product's being used to configure all that relay protection. So there's a direct mapping to say the compromise of that has an area of effect against all that relay protection equipment. And so the two that are not affected by it is the RTAC and the network switch. They're not being used by that quickset software. But the rest of the protection equipment, including the engineer working itself, is affected by those vulnerabilities in a binary sense. And so that's something that I want to introduce greater complexity to than just a clear binary representation. But that's where we're at right now. And wanting to make a more of a gradient approach, I think will really help maybe fine tune or get this model into more value, more realism to the overall complexities. And then with regard to the features, right, the thing about those controls is they're all directly applicable at the workstation, but they don't have any effect, which is problematic now. When you think about that engineering workstation can influence those other equipment, but the features of that you've applied on that workstation only protect the workstation. They don't necessarily help protect the actual vulnerability of sending the configurations, which is a problem. So you would be able to recognize that, yeah, that feature is not having great effect, even though we're saying it's there. We're doing a password policy, we're doing antivirus, we're doing those type of things. But an argument is made that that's not actually protecting against the quickset software actually communicating to their power protection equipment. So this shows you, just as a way of rolling up this model, as you're connecting the infrastructure layer, each node has its feature adjacency matrix and the vulnerability adjacency matrix. And then that's pulled out even further to say every single node of an infrastructure maintains this type of a data set to help show the effect that that piece of equipment has against other equipment. Because the network switch has its own features. It has segmentation implemented, some password policies, those type of things. And if you think about like the switch, right, network segmentation provides an area of effect, and so you can track that. So in this context of being a certain VLAN, that VLAN only allows execution to certain devices. And that's being kind of seen there in the feature adjacency matrix of the switch itself. But this picture helps show you how this model grows as you play it out through that infrastructure layer. So the key now is to then start calculating that the intensity, you could say, of both the features and the vulnerabilities. So you can see in the vulnerability side, those were the CVSS scores of those vulnerabilities that were placed on that node. So 7.4, 6.5, and so on and so on. Totaling them up and then trying to normalize them. And this morning as I was thinking about it, I took a misapproach midnight last night when I was putting this together. I don't need to divide by 32.6. I think that's appropriate. I need to divide by 40 because the CVSS is on a 10-point system. So it doesn't really, it muddies the waters by saying 7.4 is almost your highest level. 10 is my highest level. 7.4 is not my highest level. So I'll let the math play out, but that's one thing I recognize. I actually need to divide by the overall magnitude, not the magnitude of the vulnerabilities itself, to help be consistent. But letting this play out, right, that ultimately informs, you could say, the percentage that that vulnerability may have against other vulnerabilities. And so that develops that vector there. And same thing on the feature is providing a scoring of those security controls. And so the model I'm using is estimated around this idea of like ease of configuration, almost like best practice type thing. It's best practice to put that ease of configuration gives it a higher score, and likelihood is kind of around that same idea. But this is really an avenue that I'm finding is something that needs a lot of growth and a lot of more complexity. And so is there a need or a desire to get this idea of like a common feature scoring system? And then if the adjacency matrix plays out, would provide maybe a way to better contextualize a feature scoring system. But I see maybe an absence in literature for this idea of a common feature scoring system to at least help the technicians, the non-researchers, to at least have rules of thumb, to get maybe, to identify what's maybe the best common security settings to go after and translate that to a quantifiable measuring system. So I took the liberty to use my more simple approach right now. And so I take the 4 security controls I was looking at: antivirus, password protection, the password is stored in encrypted form, not a reversible form, those type of things, and aggregated those together. But once again, I need to use my overall scoring system of 10 points instead of what I did. So like with the vulnerability, I also need to reduce that down to the better normalization. But regardless of that, it produced that vector, which would then be the feature percentage vector of how those features are weighted against one another. And then the idea is now we need to transfer that around. And so this is now the marriage of taking those feature and vulnerability vectors and passing them through the adjacency matrix to ultimately then, so that each piece of equipment has the overall magnitude of how each of the features and the vulnerabilities impacted one another. So the new feature for the actual equipment nodes is a listing of the collection of all that features or vulnerabilities from all its neighbors. And so that one down at the bottom has the 12 spaces because there's 12 pieces of equipment on this infrastructure scope that I'm analyzing. And you can see, right, from a feature point of view, the first one is the engineer work itself, and it totals to 1 because it's a percentage game. And then the next one is the network switch is the only one that actually had features installed on it. And so let the numbers play out, and it presented itself with an 83% essentially influence of the protections that the network switch is providing. Helps influence a little bit of the engineering workstation. Was we getting at, and then the protection equipment had no feature control on it. Basically, they're turned on and they're implemented to operate, but they're not using any cybersecurity features in its protection, which is sometimes common. It's starting to improve. A lot of the OEMs are baking a lot more security features into their products now, but it goes by the adage, just because installed doesn't mean the features were turned on. And so using one of my colleagues, he's focusing on more of the electrical engineering side. He installed and turned them on, but no security has actually been laid on, so I'm representing that here and showing how that has now effect by a lot of the adjacent equipment had no security features to help influence the ultimate security here for this workstation. So just like I did with the features, I did the same thing with the vulnerabilities. So I took the level of vulnerabilities that existed on that engineer workstation and passed that around. But there is no vulnerabilities identified for the other equipment on this infrastructure. So the other equipment had no vulnerabilities by which to influence the workstation itself. So in this example, all the vulnerabilities being pushed out from the engineering workstation. Because at the moment, that's the only piece of equipment that's been identified to have vulnerabilities in this substation. And that's how that one played out there. So once I passed all that information around, I now enter it through my transfer function that you guys saw earlier, and the sum of the features minus the sum of the vulnerability divided by the overall feature strength ended up creating a 45% cyber protection level for this piece of equipment. So with the current controls and the current vulnerabilities, it's estimated to have 45% protection level. So as a decision maker, you say, is that acceptable? Maybe. It all depends on the organization's risk culture or their threshold to ultimately determine that. Yeah. Yeah, at the current, this is very much relying on like their expertise judgment on it. Like from a SME in their organization, this is our posture. At the moment, no, but it certainly is an avenue. Haven't thought of that. Correct. So if you think about like, okay, this number, what can you do about it? Like if you ask the question, is it no longer sufficient based on their expert judgment? What can you do? Well, obviously, if you increase the amount of feature sets in your network, you're obviously going to drive up that left-hand number. And if you can reduce by patching or asset stewardship the vulnerabilities and maybe their influence around that environment, you are obviously able to drop down the right-hand side, and that interplay then would help drive up the number or reduce the number. Because if you had 0 vulnerabilities, the right-hand side would be -0, so you'd have 100%. If you have all vulnerabilities and no security controls, you end up getting a negative number, which is problematic. So that's where I'm trying to figure out better ways to normalize the information to keep it within 0 to 100. Barring just simple if it's below negative, just consider it 0. Trying to get a little bit more creative in that. But at the moment, then that helps kind of maybe place a number, place a metric to make decisions around. So then you can relate that to, okay, what's that impact for this engineering workstation, the consequence of that workstation. So piecing it around, so you see two lines there, a dashed line and then the new line. So the original impact assessment against that engineering workstation was estimated to have those magnitudes of reputational, financial, safety type impacts. And you can see initially it was well within acceptance. Things were green, things were yellow, so we felt okay with it. But as that metric adjusted the overall influence, because it's 45%, it increased because you could say if it's 1, it stays the same. Your original impact is unaffected by any vulnerabilities that are on the system. That's an ideal world where there's no vulnerabilities. But as vulnerabilities exist, they start to change the impact potential of that engineering workstation. So that's what this is getting at, is after we calculate that number, you take the original impact and adjust it based on that calculated metric. In this case, because there was the effect of those vulnerabilities in place, ended up causing us to have an unacceptable operational categorization. The categorization went from in the yellow threshold, which you could argue is either acceptable or not based on the risk culture of the organization, into the red where it says it's no longer acceptable, period. So we need to do something about it. We need to, obviously, in the real world would be, okay, we need to go patch that equipment. But identifying that through this categorization. And then this just speaks to the idea, right, that each node has that impact view because each node in this thing has a signal characteristic to it. Like I said, one of my assumptions up front is every single equipment is on this network for a reason. We don't have equipment that just exists. If it just exists, it should just be taken away because you're not participating in a cyber-physical system unless you're actually participating in the overall process. So future development, to wrap up, looking at bringing in other domain knowledge. So one that I'm interested in is operational information, performance information, like actual, how is the system working in real time in a sense. Getting that information flowing in to make for dynamic changes. And then regulatory or enforcement layers like NERC SIP, those type of things that require you to take certain actions. Can those be represented to ask questions of like, are you actually adhering to regulatory requirements? There's a regulatory that you must have password policies. Can that be correlated to identification of password features? If there's not, you can maybe use those tools to drive increased impacts to then allow business decision makers to say, yeah, we need to refocus our workforce on accomplishing those actions. Other things I'm looking at doing is obviously more nuance in the existing things, in the existing layers, the feature vulnerability and the signal layers, because right now it's very binary, and as we want to get more context, get more realism, we're going to want to get into gradient mathematics, where you can actually say, okay, just because this exists and has all this adjacency, not all adjacencies treated the same. So can you have a gradient? So like immediate neighbors are 1, but secondary neighbors are 0.66. Like show a gradient decline in that adjacency matrix. That's some of the complexity that I want to get to versus just this binary analysis. And then, like I said, kind of another one, figuring out better ways to do feature scoring. Because that's really where this model is going to succeed, and if I can't get through that, it stays overly simple, and simple works for certain types of people, but it doesn't work for us engineers. We don't like the simple, and we don't feel good about it. So figuring out better ways to score the system, and then let the adjacency answer that context problem, so that this becomes a tool that anybody can use, like CVSS, but it doesn't lose its value, which some of the arguments were made. So I will leave it at that, because we have about 5 minutes for any questions or comments, because our next talk is the keynote speaker at Open. Yeah. Correct. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yes. Yes. Yep. 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 Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Yeah. It's a general platform to start with. Yeah. Correct. Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Correct. Correct. And there will always chase, especially in the context of an individual, the unknown unknowns will always haunt us. And at some point, I'm trying to say, okay, what is sufficient to at least make better decisions? But from a scientist or a researcher, they're like, yeah, I never want to exist at that layer. I am down doing the sticks analysis where you're doing 67,000 nodes against that. But it takes 2 weeks to analyze it. Is there a way that we can bubble it up, aggregate it to a sufficient state by which to maybe make immediate decisions for the manager, for the help desk, for the what have you, that just they like the color. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yes. Correct. Yeah. Correct. And that's where the hope, where this simplification mechanism might lend itself to the decision. Say it appears like there's a potential for safety to an unacceptable level, or an operational impact to an unacceptable level. but it's an appearance of, which may then launch into the in-depth analysis. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 Appreciate it. Okay. 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 Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. 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 Okay. No, that's good insight. Okay. Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah. So I can adjust it. Okay. Yeah. 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 Well, that would be that definitely fit into an absence in the literature, because I don't think anybody's gone to that approach. So, no, I think that's a useful insight. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Correct. Yes. 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 Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.